Throughout history, death has claimed countless lives in ways both predictable and utterly bizarre. Wars, diseases, and natural disasters fill the pages of our history books. But scattered among these familiar tragedies lie stories so strange, so impossibly absurd, that they challenge everything we think we know about how life can end. These are the deaths that make you question reality itself. The accidents so peculiar that if they appeared in a movie, audiences would dismiss them as unrealistic fiction. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view the randomness of existence. I've spent months researching the most documented yet unbelievable accidental deaths in recorded history. We're talking about verified accounts from historical records, court documents, and eyewitness testimonies that chronicle endings so bizarre they seem crafted by the universe's darkest sense of humor. These aren't urban legends or folklore passed down through generations. These are real people who met their end in ways that defy logic, probability, and sometimes the very laws of physics themselves. By the end of this series, you'll understand why historians often struggle to include these accounts in serious academic work. Not because they're untrue, but because they're so outlandishly improbable that they sound like elaborate jokes. You'll discover deaths involving everyday objects that became instruments of the most unlikely doom. Freak accidents that required such a perfect storm of circumstances that mathematicians would struggle to calculate the odds. And endings so absurd that the victims themselves probably couldn't have imagined them in their wildest nightmares. But here's what makes these stories truly fascinating. Each death reveals something profound about the delicate thread that separates life from oblivion. One moment, these people were going about their ordinary daily routines, completely unaware that the universe was orchestrating their most extraordinary exit. These weren't daredevils or risk-takers seeking thrills. These were merchants, scholars, farmers, and nobles whose only crime was existing at the wrong place during the wrong cosmic alignment of absurdity. Let me start with a death so ridiculous that it launched an entire philosophical debate about fate versus coincidence. In ancient Greece, around 456 BCE, the great playwright Aeschylus was considered one of the founding fathers of tragedy. His works explored themes of divine justice, human suffering, and the cruel whims of the gods. Ironically, his own death would become the kind of darkly comedic scene that would have fit perfectly in one of his rivals' comedies. Aeschylus had received a prophecy that he would be killed by a falling object from the sky. Being a rational man of letters, he decided to outsmart fate by spending his time in open fields where no buildings, trees, or cliffs could drop anything on him. He felt clever, calculating, completely in control of his destiny. What he hadn't considered was that the sky itself might have other plans. On that fateful day, an eagle soaring high above spotted what it believed to be a large rock suitable for cracking open the turtle clutched in its talons. Eagles, you see, had developed this ingenious hunting technique of dropping hard-shelled prey onto rocks to access the meat inside. The eagle released its cargo with precision, aiming for what appeared to be a perfect stone surface below. That surface was Aeschylus's bald head. The turtle struck the playwright with enough force to crush his skull instantly. The man who had spent his career chronicling the tragic ironies of human existence became the victim of perhaps history's most tragically ironic death. He had successfully avoided every conceivable falling object that human logic could predict, only to be killed by the one scenario that no reasonable person would ever consider. A turtle dropped by an eagle who mistook a human head for a rock. But wait, because this story gets even more absurd. The turtle survived the impact. Historical accounts suggest it actually crawled away from the scene, completely unharmed by its unintentional role as a murder weapon. So not only did Aeschylus die in the most ridiculous way imaginable, but his killer didn't even have the decency to perish alongside him. This death sparked centuries of debate among philosophers about predestination versus free will. Did Aeschylus fulfill his prophesied doom precisely because he tried to avoid it? Was this divine comedy orchestrated by the same gods he had written about so eloquently? Or was it simply the most improbable coincidence in recorded history, a mathematical impossibility that somehow manifested in reality? The story of Aeschylus represents just the beginning of our journey into history's most bewildering accidental deaths. What makes his demise particularly fascinating is how it established a template that we'll see repeated throughout the centuries. A perfectly ordinary day, a reasonable person making logical decisions, and then the universe intervening with such spectacular randomness that it borders on the supernatural. As we dive deeper into these accounts, you'll notice patterns emerging. The victims often took precautions that should have protected them, only to have those very precautions contribute to their bizarre endings. You'll discover deaths involving the most innocent objects imaginable, transformed into agents of doom through circumstances so unlikely that they challenge our understanding of probability itself. Our next case takes us to medieval England, where a man's passion for honey nearly rewrote the laws of physics through sheer stupidity. In 1367, a beekeeper named Thomas de Bradwardine had developed what he considered a revolutionary method for harvesting honey without disturbing his precious bees. Rather than using smoke or protective clothing like every other beekeeper in existence, Thomas had convinced himself that bees responded to music. His theory was beautifully simple and completely insane. He believed that if he played his wooden flute while approaching the hives, the bees would become so entranced by the melody that they would peacefully allow him to extract their honey. For weeks, this method had worked surprisingly well, though historians now suspect this had more to do with the particular docility of his bee colonies than any musical appreciation on their part. On the morning of his death, Thomas had decided to attempt his most ambitious honey harvest yet. He had discovered a massive wild hive nestled high in an ancient oak tree, easily containing enough honey to sustain his family through the winter. The hive was positioned about 30 feet above ground, accessible only by climbing the tree's thick branches while carrying his wooden collection buckets and, of course, his magical bee-charming flute. Thomas began his ascent with confidence, stopping every few feet to play what he believed were particularly soothing melodies. The bees seemed calm, almost indifferent to his presence. Encouraged by this apparent success, he climbed higher, eventually reaching a branch directly beneath the massive hive. He positioned himself carefully, hanging his collection buckets from nearby branches and preparing his flute for what he anticipated would be his masterpiece performance. What Thomas had failed to consider was that this particular hive belonged to a species of bees known for their extreme territorial aggression when exposed to certain high-pitched frequencies. The very notes that had calmed his domestic bees acted as a battle cry to these wild specimens. The moment he began playing, the entire hive erupted in fury. But here's where this story transcends ordinary bee attack into the realm of cosmic absurdity. As thousands of enraged bees swarmed around him, Thomas panicked and began playing his flute even more frantically, somehow convinced that the right melody would still save him. The increased volume and frantic pitch of his music only further enraged the bees, creating a feedback loop of escalating chaos. In his desperation to escape the swarm while continuing to play his flute, Thomas made a critical miscalculation. He attempted to swing from his current branch to a lower one, using only one hand while keeping his flute pressed to his lips with the other. Physics, as it tends to do, asserted itself with ruthless efficiency. Thomas lost his grip and began falling, but his death wasn't caused by the 30-foot drop or even the bee stings covering his body. As he plummeted toward the ground, still clutching his flute in panic, the wooden instrument was driven straight through his throat by the force of impact when he struck a protruding tree root below. The man who believed music could charm bees was killed by his own instrument in the most literal way possible. The bees, apparently satisfied with their victory, returned to their hive and never bothered anyone again. Local villagers found Thomas 3 days later, his body covered in bee stings, his flute protruding from his neck like some macabre wind instrument, and his collection bucket still hanging uselessly from the tree branches above. This death became legendary, not just for its bizarre circumstances, but for the philosophical questions it raised about the relationship between human ambition and natural law. Thomas had developed an elaborate theory based on zero scientific understanding, convinced himself of its validity through limited success, and then died when reality reasserted itself in the most dramatically ironic way possible. What makes this case particularly fascinating is how Thomas's death perfectly illustrates the dangerous intersection of confidence and ignorance. He wasn't a reckless thrill seeker or an unfortunate victim of random chance. He was a man who had created his own elaborate system of logic, tested it successfully enough to build false confidence, and then discovered that the universe doesn't negotiate with human delusions. The story of Thomas de Bradwardine established another recurring theme in history's strangest accidental deaths. The victims often possessed just enough knowledge to be dangerous, combined with just enough success to be overconfident. They created elaborate plans that accounted for everything except the fundamental flaw in their basic assumptions. But if you think a man being killed by his own flute while falling from a tree during a bee attack represents the peak of accidental death absurdity, you haven't seen anything yet. These stories reveal something profound about the delicate balance between order and chaos that governs our existence. Each victim believed they understood the rules of their world, only to discover that the universe operates by a far stranger logic than human minds can comprehend. Aeschylus thought he could outsmart prophecy through rational planning. Thomas believed music could control nature itself. Both men died precisely because their logical precautions led them directly into the path of impossibly unlikely doom. What makes these deaths truly unsettling isn't their gore or violence, but their randomness. They remind us that despite all our planning, preparation, and rational thinking, we remain vulnerable to forces so absurd that our brains struggle to process them as real. These weren't deaths that could be prevented through better safety regulations or common sense. They were cosmic accidents that required such perfect storms of coincidence that they seemed designed by some malevolent deity with an appreciation for dark comedy. The next time you're going about your ordinary daily routine, remember these stories, not to live in fear, but to appreciate the miraculous improbability that you've survived another day without being struck by a falling turtle, impaled by your own musical instrument, or meeting some equally ridiculous end. Every moment of normal existence is actually an extraordinary victory against the universe's apparent desire to eliminate us through the most embarrassing means possible. History's weirdest accidental deaths prove that truth really is stranger than fiction, and sometimes the most dangerous enemy we face is our own certainty about how the world works.